I don't know about you, but I've had a lot of fun journeying through the minor prophets this summer. There's a little doom and gloom, a little judgment, all the things that we love about life of faith. That's just a joke. But apparently not a funny one, but that's okay. But, we're probably ready to be done with the minor prophets, which today is the last day in our summer series as we go through sort of these lesser-known people of the Bible, but also through Israel's story. That's what it takes us to. The minor prophets take us through Israel's story, where we experience sort of this failure, restored, failure, restored, failure, restored. It just seems to be this broken record of the story, right? And last week we talked about Zechariah and the people's return from Babylon and from exile into the promised land, but they were given this condition, and that condition was live faithfully to the call that God has given you. You see, the people of Israel so easily forget the purpose for which God has set them apart. I have to constantly be reminded of what that purpose is, because the human heart, when left to itself, will turn inward. That's what it does. It's by nature. And so God has to keep calling the people back. There has to be people in the life of Israel who keep calling the people back to the heart of God. And that is the reason why I chose this sermon series. I think it speaks so intimately to American Christianity. How easily we get distracted by the world. How easily we get knocked off course from the purpose for which God has set us apart. How easily we make it about us instead of Him. And yet, God's story is a story of grace. Time and time again, the people fail, and time again, God shows up. And this time, shows up with the promise of someone who is greater, a Savior who is coming. We open our Bibles this morning to the book of Malachi, chapter 4, reading verses 5 and 6. You're not reading God's holy word. See, I will send the prophet Elijah to you before the great and dreadful day of the Lord comes. He will turn the hearts of the parents to their children, and the hearts of the children to their parents, or else I will come and strike the land with total destruction. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Let's pray. Gracious God, we give you thanks for your word on which we stand. We give you thanks for the grace that you have poured out on us, the Savior you have sent to us. May we bear witness to Him. All may your word dwell in us as we dwell in it. We pray this in the name of our Savior, Jesus Christ. For the last 18 years, I've lived here in Western Pennsylvania, and as many of you know, I'm from Northeast Ohio, and my fandom lies in that great city of Cleveland. And the only thing I'm pretty sure that has gotten me through that fanhood are the Cleveland Indians. The Cavs have sort of been up and down, but the Indians for the last 25 years have been good. And the reason I say that is football season is upon us, and all I really had to rely on over the years was to respond to all of you and say, well, at least I have the Indians. Because the truth is, the Pirates are like the Browns of Major League Baseball. So I just had to throw that zinger in there. Some of you think that we might have a football team this year, but I'll believe it when I see it. I'm not trusting that. And my friend Mike over here knows what I'm talking about. We're together at this point. I just outed you. I'm sorry, but it's true. I digress a little bit, but I tell you that because as a fan, as a kid, the Indians were great. It was a tremendous time in the late 90s, and I got to go to a game. We didn't get to go often, but my uncle had season tickets, and he called us last week. He said, I can't go. My dad was like, great. And he put me in the car, and we got to the game. We got to the game in the bottom of the second inning, and the Indians were losing 11-1. All right, so you get there and you kind of think this second was over, right? But my dad, when he was a teenager, he was at a Notre Dame football game and they were getting killed, and he left. And he missed the greatest comeback in Notre Dame history. And so he promised himself at that point in his life that he would never do that again. He would never leave a game early. And so when the fifth inning came along, the Indians were losing 15-2. And I leaned over to my dad and I said, I think we should leave this one early. And he said, nope, you never know what's going to happen. I was like, I'm pretty sure I know what's going to happen here, right? Except true to Franklin fashion, we stayed, and thank God we did, because they won the game 21-18. It was the greatest sporting experience I had ever had. They were hitting home runs all over the place, and guess what? We were one of the few thousand people who stayed in this stadium. Of the 42,000 that showed up, we were of the few that stayed and saw it happen. The next day, I got to my baseball game, and I'm telling all my friends about how awesome it was, because they hadn't watched it on TV, but I got to be there. And my coach said, "Oh, I was there too." And I said, "Did you stay?" He said, "Oh no, we left in the fifth inning." He said, "We got off the turnpike, and the turnpike attendant saw our Indians gear." We didn't have Easy Pass back then. And he said, "Did you leave the game?" And we said, "Yes." And he said, "Oh, they just won." And I thought it was a joke. I had to turn the radio on to verify. He said, "I'm so mad at myself for leaving." But that's what we do, right? When the odds are stacked against us, when we see that it just seems like an insurmountable mountain to climb, the easiest thing to do is to give up. I mean, we can make jokes about that as fans of sports teams, but in life, it really is the easiest thing. Just to move on to something else, to go a different direction. It's easy for us to just kind of let go when everything seems too hard or we're not going to be able to overcome it, right? We understand this story when a family says to an addict, "We just can't put ourselves here anymore," right? We get that. We can't continue to get hurt. We understand the story when a spouse that's been hurt over and over and over again finally just says, I got to get out. I can't do this anymore. And I think as people, we understand that part of it. I understand that when it gets so hard, when it just seems like it's over, those people let us down over and over and over and over again. We understand the person that just says, "I'm done. I'm out. No more." What we have a harder time grasping are the people who stay, right? As outsiders, as we watch those things play out in people's lives, I'm guilty of it all the time. I say, if it was me, I'd just leave, right? I don't need to deal with that. I wouldn't put up with that anymore. Why do you keep doing that? And we've all asked those questions of other people, maybe sometimes of ourselves. Because the easiest thing to do when someone continuously lets you down over and over and over again is to dust off your hands, to wash your hands clean, and to walk away. Right? And honestly, I don't know if anybody would blame God in Israel's story to go, these people just don't seem to get it. It's been 100 years when Malachi comes on to the scene as the prophet, since they returned from Babylon. Zechariah, if you remember, he brought the people back. He was the prophet that brought them back, and he gave them a condition, and that condition was, God wants to bless you, but you have to remain faithful to the covenant and to the promises that I have given you. At first, they say yes. And I don't use this image lightly, but it's like that addict that struggles to stay clean. They get clean, they make the promises, they want to do right, they want to be good, and then they just fall back into those destructive patterns. And I say that because I've been through it with family members, and many of you have too. I use that image on purpose because that's how bad it is. Over and over again. The people of God say, we're going to do it right this time. And then they just fall back once again into destructive patterns. They fall back into themselves. They forget the blessings that God has given to them. And they forget the purpose by which they were set apart. Just 100 years after losing all of it and returning to once again this promise that God has given them, they're right back where their ancestors were. It was Zechariah's warning. Don't do that. Don't go back into oppressing the poor. Don't go back into unjust practices. Don't go back to forgetting the widow or the foreigner. Don't do it. Here we are 100 years later, and we're right back where we started. At that point, I would think God could say, maybe another group of people can do this better than you, right? It's been thousands of years of failure. Thousands of years of failing to live out the purpose for which God has set Israel apart. And that's the culture and the time that Malachi is speaking into. It's 100 years after the return, and it's 400 years before the arrival of Jesus into the nation of Israel. A huge gap that we see. The next book is the New Testament. So we see this huge gap from this prophecy to what God is promising. But you see, the beauty of the Scripture story, the beauty of the gospel, is that even though the people fail over and over and over and over and over, God never gives up. He never washes his hands clean of the Israelites and say, you're just too far gone. You're just not worth it. You just can't live out the way that I've set you apart to live out. Because 100 years later, the people are back to the wealthy, are getting wealthier, the poor are getting poorer, they're building their wealth and they're back to the poor. I might sound like a broken record, but you see, friends, this is what the human heart does when left to its own and not called back to the heart of God. We become selfish and individualistic. We care more about what we can get rather than what we have to offer. We see the world revolving around us rather than us as participants in it. It is far easier to live that way than to bear witness to the world for the sake of the kingdom of God. It's so easy for us, especially in this culture and context, to get distracted from what God has set us apart as the church for. And so Malachi breaks down into these 6 sections. And it basically goes like this. And all 6 sections follow this same pattern. That God confronts the people. The people say, we didn't do that. We hear that a lot in our house in the 3 and 5. Not me, wasn't me, it was that one. Right? We didn't do it. And God then gets the final word and saying, you have, and this is what it looks like. And so you can even actually take those 6 sections and break them down into 2. 1, you have God who's exposing the people of Israel for their failures, and how they've lived in relationship to Him and to one another. And then you have God confronting those things in their lives and who they are. Right? So that's what we get in these sections of Malachi, because and Malachi plays the mediator between God and the people. And so there's 2 takeaways that we get here. The first is that God attacks their worship. He actually says to them, you have defiled the temple. Now, according to the Old Testament, worship that is void of action or justice. And I don't mean, when I say justice, I don't mean justice the way that we understand it in politics. We're talking about God's justice in the world. So we talk about worship void of God's justice in the world. Worship void of action is futile. It's useless. And so God says to the people, you come to the temple and you have defiled it. And you know what the people say in response? They go back and say, what do you mean? We haven't done anything. We haven't done anything wrong. We haven't done anything at all. And God responds and goes, that's exactly the point. You haven't done anything. You've come to the temple to receive the blessing and at the same time have withheld your tithe from me. You come to the temple to worship and to receive the blessing of the priest, but you have withheld my justice to those on the outside. You have failed to live out your purpose. As I think about American Christianity and our culture and context, it strikes home, doesn't it? So often we come to worship to receive the blessings of God. So often we come to worship to hear a good sermon or to listen or sing songs that we like. So often we make worship about me. We go through the motions, the obligations of it. When God says to the people, you have withheld your tithe, what he's actually saying is, I want to bless you, but I can't bless you because you haven't lived in faithfulness to my call. See, what we give and what we offer is a sign and a symbol of our faithfulness to God. It's trusting that God is going to use what we give him for his glory. And we can't think that way when our view of the church doesn't meet my needs or satisfy what I desire. The church becomes all about me. It's no longer about him. This is what the people of Israel have done. They may have gone to the temple. They may have gone to worship, but their worship didn't influence their action in the world. If our worship is simply an obligation, it's simply showing up and getting here on time and doing and putting in our hour, and when I go 5 minutes over, going, no, I got things to do. You guys don't do that, by the way. I really don't. I'm not even joking. You don't. But if that's our attitude, we've checked our box for the week. That's who Malachi's talking about. Because if worship doesn't influence the way that we live, the relationships that we have among one another, and then our relationship to the world, it isn't worship. Worship apart from God's justice, it's not worship. Worship that's more about what I get than what I give, it's not worship. And that's what God is calling out the people of Israel. You come and you store up for yourself, but you fail to be a blessing to others. So then the second part of Malachi says this. He says that God's going to write down the faithful on the scroll. What Malachi is actually doing is pointing us to Scripture and the story. He has this vision of names and stories of the faithful, of the remnant. He says, learn it, know it, live it. The faithful remnant who hold on to what it means to be a blessing to the world, that understand their purpose, the reason that God has set them apart. You see, the whole book is tied up in this one word, faithfulness. What we give is out of faithfulness to God. It's a sign and a symbol that we trust and believe that God has work to do in this world. And that's of our time, and of our talents, and of our treasures. And the second part is faithfulness to the story. God says when we're faithful, that our story is wrapped up and tied into the story of the heroes of the faith, those that have gone before us. We often think like this. I know King David. I know Elijah. I know prophet. I know disciple. I'm not Peter. I'm not James. I'm not Matthew. I'm not that. But you see, you are. You are because God calls ordinary people to do extraordinary things through. God does the extraordinary through ordinary people who are willing to be faithful. And that's the call of Prophet Malachi to faithful women. He says the faithful will rejoice at the coming of the Lord. It seems a little, he uses these two words, great on one hand and destruction on the other. But he says the dreadful day of the Lord. He says the great and dreadful day of the Lord held together, which is fascinating. But you see, he says dreadful because the pain of turning our hearts back to God. That's the point. And that the faithful will rejoice. This is what Malachi says. The faithful will rejoice in the great and dreadful day of the Lord. Not because we win and others lose. We rejoice because that Savior, that promise of God, is going to turn people's hearts back to Him. last explanation right here at the end of the book, there's this promise of a Messiah, the one in the day of the Lord who's going to come and make all things new. And he actually says that, remember the law of Moses that I gave to you on Mount Horeb, and remember that prophet Elijah, the guy who's known to be the greatest prophet. I'm going to send you a Savior, and he's greater than all of you. It's a promise given to those who have fallen so utterly short of the glory of God. Promise of a Savior to come who will make all things new. It's a story of grace. In the face of failure, over and over and over again, we get tied into God's overarching story of grace. That's what the prophets point to. Remember the law? Remember the scriptures that I have given to you? Remember the prophets who have spoken in my name? I'm going to tie you into this story. So my glory might be known in all the earth. And that only happens by His grace. See, like the Israelites, we fall short time and time and time and time again. And yet we're given this promise, this future hope of a Savior. Not just one who has come, but one who is coming again. And until that day, we're called to live as a faithful remnant. Malachi is tying the Israelites into God's grander story. That's what Scripture is for us. Scripture is not just rules for us to live by. The Bible is not just an account of our history that leads us to this moment. It's God's story of redemption playing out in our lives that we get to participate in. And that story teaches us that no matter what happens in life, God does not give up on. This week I read an article, a blog post on the Gospel Coalition website. It's about a man, about 60 years old. He struggled his whole life. He was emotionally, mentally abused, physically abused by his father as a child, only boy. Always felt like an outcast, bullied most of his life. He struggled with his sexuality, he struggled with his identity, he struggled with his marriage, he struggled as a parent. Everything that he wrote about in his life, he said, was a struggle. One night, his boys were away. His wife was at a conference. He decided that the struggle was over. As he was writing and finishing his suicide note on his desk, his wife walked into their room. And he spun in fear, he said. Fear because she wasn't supposed to come home until tomorrow. She said to him, "It just felt like God was telling me to come home and say to you, it's time that you grieve and accept the things that have happened to you in your life." Grieve, he wrote, question mark. It was so hard the first time around. Why would I want to go through that again? In his mind, at that point, it was easier to just give up. And then he said he couldn't shake it. The words of Scripture ringing in his soul, echoing in his heart. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. sorrow may last for the evening, joy comes in the morning. And he thought to himself, my morning will lead to a new morning. And so he did as his wife suggested. And he began to accept his story as his life lived. Listen to the words he writes. By not being afraid to feel the pain that comes from sin, sorrow, shame, and suffering, we find reconciliation and redemption. In fact, we find what we were hungry for all along. Jesus. As I think about that terrified little boy 50 years ago, as if I can hear Jesus saying now, I know this brute of a daddy and other bullies and abusers are hurting you deeply, but oh, just you wait. Wait and see how I use this, not only to embrace you, but to give your life value and meaning. You're going to have something so good to share. A way to love others, a way to preach me. It'll be worth it, my friend. You may feel like a victim now, but I'm going to make you so much better. As if this all never happened in the first place. Because you, my child, are more than a conqueror. And he ends with this. I can embrace my story because I now know I am embraced by the author of my story. As I thought about Israel, the prophets, God's story of grace, friends, we can embrace our story. Embrace it with the sin and shame that are so deeply rooted in each and every one of us. Because His grace has been poured out on us. Because God does not give up on us. And we need to look no further than the cross and resurrection of our Lord for that. God does not give up on you. He doesn't give up on Israel. He doesn't give up on the church. And He doesn't give up on you. May we embrace our story because we have been embraced by the author of it. May we bear witness to His grace and to His glory in our lives and in this world because Jesus has come and made all things new. God doesn't get up and walk out on the fifth day. He stays until the end. And in the end, we win because Jesus has won. God's grace has been poured out. Accept it. Receive it. And live it. Because our story is ultimately a story of grace. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Let us now stand and affirm.